Before we start with the review, I just wanted to say I put a lot of time into this one, as you could probably tell by the length of the video. So if you wouldn't mind leaving me a like and maybe subscribing, I would really appreciate that. Secondly, I won't be spoiling any of the story details outside of the first 45 minutes or so, and I'm only going to show the first couple of bosses. And lastly, I won't be spoiling the final biome. With all that said, I hope you enjoy the review. If you saw the reveal of the PS5 and thought that the upcoming generation of gaming would be near identical to the PS4, having a collection of story-driven third-person games that are accessible to a wide demographic, whether that's because of their difficulty or lack thereof, inviting gameplay mechanics, or a straightforward, easy-to-digest story, well then let me introduce you to Returnal. Returnal is a brand new exclusive to the PS5 and is developed by Housemarque. If you're like me and have never heard of them before, then you probably wouldn't have known what to expect prior to release. Well, after finishing all 3 acts of Returnal, I feel like an idiot for never playing any of Housemarque's games. Because Returnal absolutely is the best thing out at the moment, and I feel so bad for anyone unable to play this due to the lack of PlayStation 5s that exist in the world right now. Okay, so what exactly is Returnal? Well, this is a third-person bullet hell shooter, roguelike Metroidvania, with some emphasis put on story and psychological horror. Now that you know the genre Returnal squarely fits into, let me quickly explain each of them. Firstly, the perspective gameplay is being played through is the most easy to come to terms with. You're shooting guns with an over-the-shoulder camera. The bullet hell label comes from the majority of enemy attacks being slow-moving projectiles that are designed to be easily dodged. The term easily dodged can quickly be stripped away once you're in a small room with multiple enemies shooting out projectiles that are all moving at different speeds and are layering on top of each other. Due to this, you're probably going to die a lot, and that's where the second genre comes in. This is a roguelike, much like Dead Cells, Hades, Risk of Rain 2, and so on. Except the most notable difference between those games and this is that Returnal is a AAA exclusive, with visuals matching that of the best looking games released today. Unless I'm forgetting something, I believe this is the first AAA game ever released and could potentially be the introduction to the genre for many people. So it's a real shame then that this is where Returnal fumbles the most, while never ruining the game, not by a long shot. However, it will cause much frustration and possibly ruin long-term playability. Thirdly are the Metroidvania-inspired pickups littered throughout the world. Run after run, you might find permanent upgrades like the hookshot, which lets you maneuver around arenas with ease or reach previously inaccessible areas. Lastly, there are the story and psychological horror aspects, and I think these two blend together the best. The majority of this game is third person, but there are a few first person sequences in Helios or the house Celine grew up in, and yeah, these sequences can be pretty terrifying. Returnal has been out for just over a week now, and despite its very impressive Metacritic score, there has been a lot of discussion around the negative aspects of the game. These mainly include the difficulty and the roguelike aspects. This review will also delve deep into the negatives surrounding this masterfully created game. What I mean by that is, I'm going to talk about all the things I absolutely loved: combat, visuals, audio, and presentation. But also all the stuff that I disliked or think could have been done a lot better. The last thing I have to say before we continue is that Returnal absolutely has flaws, but none of them bring down this experience for one simple reason: that there is no question in my mind that this has the best third-person shooting in any game. Returnal is set sometime in the future and follows the many lives of Celine. Disobeying orders, Astra explorer Celine decides to explore the off-limits planet of Atropos to investigate something she calls the White Shadow. Upon entering the atmosphere, Celine's ship Helios suffers major damage and she is forced to crash land. Helios is destroyed, so you decide to explore the planet looking for White Shadow. You'll quickly discover a corpse of yourself lying on the ground and recover your sidearm. From here you'll begin to fight basic enemies, find audio logs scattered throughout the environment, and scan items to reveal their purpose. The first run is essentially the tutorial, teaching you how to aim and shoot, jump and dodge over enemy projectiles, and environmental hazards. A short time later, you'll run into this horrifying predator and abruptly die. Some creepy imagery will play, Celine crashes her ship again, and the title card rolls. Welcome to Returnal. The introduction here is done so perfectly. Unlike most other roguelikes that chuck enemies in the first room, Returnal does the opposite. Its start is slow, and it's trying to get you immersed into this universe and the world of Atropos. While the gameplay is king here, I think it was the right decision to hook players in with the story first, because this is all about mystery. It's about understanding and uncovering why Celine is stuck in a time loop. From this point forward, the majority of the story is revealed through audio logs you'll find hidden around the world. These come plentiful in the early hours and are played in a non-linear fashion. This story is completely jumbled, and much of it is left up to interpretation, so be wary if you don't enjoy that style of storytelling. It won't be for everyone, and I certainly enjoyed the mysterious aspects of the story much more than the actual reveal of what is happening. The last thing I'll say about story is that in the first biome, you'll run into the house that Celine grew up in, and these segments are played in first person and are the most obvious use of the psychological horror aspects surging through Returnal's veins. Even if you don't enjoy the type of story Returnal is trying to tell, I think you will get great satisfaction out of these clearly PT-inspired sections. So that's the story of Returnal. It's interesting and engaging, but it's far more about the journey than the destination, while serving up a healthy amount of scares. Now that you know how the story works in Returnal, let me discuss how the gameplay structure revolves around that while not getting too bogged down in roguelike criticisms. But don't worry, those will come later. Like every roguelike, once you die, you are sent back to the beginning with nothing but your basic weapon. When you leave the starting room where Helios is destroyed, you'll notice that it probably looks different from the last time you died. And that's because this entire world is procedurally generated, meaning each room is made up of a combination of procedural generation and pre-made tiles. You could run into a room that looks identical to a previous room, but this time it's flipped, or it only has 2 doorways leading out where previously it had 3. There are also 4 different types of rooms dispersed throughout each biome. Firstly is your basic arena with enemies. These rooms can also have health upgrades, chests, environmental hazards, and collectibles. Secondly are the hazardous rooms that will have things like lasers that you need to dodge, platforms you need to correctly jump to, and corrupted water you can't walk through. Thirdly are the treasure rooms. They can have a chest in them, a place to buy items, or some type of ability. And lastly are the challenge rooms that throw waves of enemies at you for a big reward. Toward the end of each biome, you'll get the chance to fight a boss. If it's your first time defeating said boss, you'll unlock a Metroidvania type ability. For example, the first major unlock you get is the sword, which allows you to do melee attacks, and also destroy red vines, which gains access to new areas. Okay, so that's basically the entire structure of Returnal. Spawn, loot, shoot, find collectibles, and permanent upgrades, and try to reach the next biome and the next boss. Before we talk about the gameplay, let me briefly go over the technical aspects. From the very first second you raise your sidearm at the alien-like creatures standing in front of you, and they charge up their ominous blue light releasing a line of projectiles, you'll notice that Returnal doesn't look like many other AAA games. Since this is a bullet hell, one moment gameplay will look like this, and the next it will look like this. The particles are dense, the lighting is atmospheric, and the art design has such an ethereal quality to it. There are so many rooms you'll just walk into and stop in your tracks, taking in and marveling whatever is in front of you. This can be seen in the mythological orb seen in multiple locations, or the statues littered throughout the world, or the vistas in the fiery desert. It's clear that this was heavily inspired by H.R. Geiger and Prometheus, along with PT while in the house. Visually, Returnal is an absolute treat, and you haven't seen the half of it. Unfortunately, the visuals on display here, and the target resolution of 4K with ray tracing, is too much for the PS5 to handle, as the frame rate will consistently drop in the late game. Frame rates are fine in the beginning couple biomes, but once you reach biome 3, the dips become noticeable and frequent. This is due to areas becoming more open in their design, your weapons becoming more powerful, releasing more particles, and far more enemies being on screen at once, which in turn adds more visual noise for the console to process. Frame drops wouldn't be as big of a deal if Twitch-like reflexes weren't the key to success, but since they are, it can really hurt gameplay. If you can adapt to them like I did, they become more of an annoyance than a burden, because when the game is a solid 60 FPS, it feels magnificent. It's not all doom and gloom, however, as I would say about 75% of the game runs at 60 FPS, where the rest of the time, it's probably around 40 to 50. On the bright side at least, load times aren't a thing. You've seen it right here. There's really not much more to say about this, besides good job Housemarque. Lastly, on the technical side, is the brilliant use of the Dualsense controller. Astro's Playroom was the only real showcase of the new controller since the launch of the PlayStation 5, but now that has changed. Returnal uses the Dualsense to its truest potential and solidifies itself as a true game changer, and a next-gen feature that Microsoft should really be trying to replicate. First of all is the newly added haptic feedback, which is essentially stronger, better vibrations. Each weapon has a different haptic feedback. Shotguns will feel meaty and hit with a punch, while the pistol will feel much softer. What I believe to be the best feeling weapon, and my favourite weapon overall, is the Hollow Seeker. It's a kind of alien-like assault rifle with a high fire rate and a chance to spawn orbs around you that will shoot at your enemies. Now, this thing feels like an engine in your hands. It will charge up as you fire, and the orbs that can spawn will stack on top of the regular firing vibrations. This sense of strength in your hands, with the feedback from the vibrations, transforms already great feeling weapons into some of the best gaming has to offer. And that leads us to the adaptive triggers, which are a legitimate gameplay mechanic. They're not just used to feel the difference between a pistol and a shotgun. Pressing down on the L2 trigger will make it lock halfway, which allows you to aim in regularly. But if you pull it all the way down, you'll enter your weapon's alternative fire mode. This is a great addition for a few reasons. Firstly, it's adding additional buttons to a controller without actually adding more buttons. I know that sounds stupid, but hear me out. A controller restricts the complexity of a game's control scheme simply due to the limited amount of buttons you can bind things to. Whereas on a mouse and keyboard, you have like 20 to 30 buttons easily accessible to you. This is most evident in any game that uses 4 quick select items, or 4 different combat stances to interchange between, like Nioh or Ghost of Tsushima, or 4 special abilities, like Immortals Phoenix Rising or Assassin's Creed. The reason 4 is a special number is because of the X, circle, triangle, and square button, or the up, down, left, right on the D-pad. By Returnal using the L2 trigger for both aiming down sights and alternative fire, it frees up another button to do something else. For example, most shooters would use triangle or something like that to toggle between regular fire and alternative fire. Where here in Returnal, you can be firing your gun, and when your alternative fire comes off cooldown, you simply just need to push further down on L2, fire your weapon special, and then release pressure so you can continue firing regularly. All that can be done without moving any of your fingers. Your thumbs keep aiming you in the right direction, and your index fingers stay on the aiming and firing buttons. I do have to say though, that it can be a bit clunky when you first start out. I don't know about anyone else, but I have heavy fingers while playing games, which is something I never really noticed until I had to force myself to only use a little bit of pressure. Overall, it's a small detail. It really is, but boy does it make a big difference in combat, and on top of that, it's something that really was not possible last generation. Okay, we're a long way into this review, and we're only now talking about gameplay. But trust me, it was worth the wait, because Returnal has some of the best second-to-second combat I've ever experienced. I said at the beginning of this review that this has the best third-person shooting in any game. So now I'm going to try my best to prove it to you. Returnal's combat is made up of 3 pillars, and they are all executed perfectly. Firstly, there is the use of the Dualsense controller, which I just talked about. Then there's enemy design, which makes combat look and feel chaotic, and lastly, there's what the player has available to them. So that would be things like movement and the sense of fluidity, weaponry, which represents power, and lastly, the little things like combat buffs, aiming, animations, and so on. Let's start with the enemy design, because I believe Housemarque built the enemies first, and then figured out how the player would deal with them. The enemies in Returnal have a celestial quality to them. They look otherworldly, and they come in large numbers, and all attack so rapidly, which can feel suffocating at times, especially if your positioning is poor. About 90% of enemy attacks here are projectile based, meaning they could be basic orbs moving in a straight line, or they could be bombs that detonate in a circular arc. They could be a barrage of missile-like energy orbs, or they could be a storm of orange machine gun-like projectiles. The other 10% are the melee attacks that very few enemies have, but can absolutely get fucked. I swear most of my deaths came from these attacks, as enemies will either dash or teleport to you in between their oppressive ranged attacks. Enemies also come in 3 different tiers. Firstly, you have your basic fodder-like enemies, which typically only have 1 or 2 different attacks and come in large numbers. But to compensate for that, you can take them down in 2 or 3 hits. Secondly are your bigger, more badass type enemies that can be best explained by calling them mini-bosses. They tend to have multiple attacks, hit much harder, and have quite a bloated health bar. And lastly, you have the bosses, of which there are 5. I won't go into detail about the bosses, but I will say I found them much more visually and thematically interesting than I did challenging, but that's something we'll come back to later. Besides the unique take on enemy projectiles, you might be thinking that the enemies here sound pretty generic, but they're far from that, and this is due to everything I've talked about happening all at once. Dealing with one type of enemy at a time, even in large numbers, can be manageable, but once you start facing off against multiple different variants of enemies at once, and they have their attacks layering over each other, all coming in at different speeds, all firing at a different tempo, while there's a few turrets in the back taking pot shots at you, and an enemy that's constantly spawning more fodder enemies. Oh, and those turrets have shields on them, so you need to get up close and personal so you can use your melee attack in order to break the shield. Yeah, that's when combat begins to feel intense, and that's when Returnal is at its best. So that's the foundation of combat. There's a lot of enemies being thrown at you, a lot of projectiles, a few melee attacks, and some enemies that are invulnerable until you hit them with a melee attack. First and foremost, what I think is core to the player's experience is the twitchy nature of movement and aiming while not being precise in the execution of either. Aiming in Returnal is snappy, fast, and very forgiving. There's a lot of auto-aim here, and a lot of your attacks are homing missiles, meaning you only need to look in the general direction of enemies to take them out. Returnal isn't interested in you having pixel-perfect precision. It's not about that. It wants you to be able to hit your enemies while focusing on your movement around the battle arenas. Since there are so many projectiles constantly coming toward you, it is vital to get Celine feeling good to control, and Housemarque did a terrific job. Celine, much like aiming, is snappy, fast, and responsive. She has a high running speed, allowing for quick traversal around the map, both in and out of combat. She can jump high and dodge, both of which are extended or shortened by the length of your button press. This makes the platforming feel great. There's no guessing on how far you're going to go since you decide the distance of both. Dodging is also something you're going to want to master immediately because it has iframes attached to it, meaning you can phase through enemy projectiles without taking damage. This doubles with the platforming and puzzle elements as well. Since you can dodge through the lasers in the environment, sometimes you'll run into a room that disables your dodge, so it becomes more about your jumping and running skills. Returnal has 10 weapons, which range from your standard pistol or shotgun to a rocket launcher or machine gun, and then some weird alien type weapons like the Holoseeker, which I mentioned earlier. I will admit I didn't enjoy using every weapon, as my preference would always go towards fully automatic guns, but that's not because the others felt bad to use, they just didn't feel as powerful. The low ammunition count or slow projectile speed of some weren't overly appealing to me, but I can see some people will prefer these over the automatic weapons. I talked about the guns feeling fantastic due to the Dualsense, but it's important to note that each of these weapons also sound and look incredible. The closest comparison I could make is to the weapons in Control. They have the same characteristics and sophistication. I loved that weapons obviously have designed roles, and aren't all a jack of all trades. For example, the shotgun requires you to be in close range. The damage and accuracy fall off is steep, so sitting in the back of fights with that weapon just won't work. But if you use it correctly, you'll have some of the highest damage output of any weapon. Then you have the rocket launcher with its slow moving projectiles, which can be hard to hit, but the damage is massive. I found this weapon constantly fantastic against bosses, whereas it was a bit weaker with fodder enemies. Each of the 10 weapons also have traits attached to them, so once you first find the weapon out in the world, it is now unlocked, and so are its trait bonuses. These are randomized every time you pick up a weapon, and you unlock the traits by killing enemies with that weapon. These can be things like Rising Pitch, which increases the fire rate of the carbine, or Portal Beam on the Holoseeker, which creates a portal that shoots at enemies. This is what makes these weapons unique from their counterparts in other shooters, and also helps to spice up each run of Returnal. More on that in just a minute. Lastly, in terms of gameplay that I think really elevates the entire experience is the adrenaline feature and overload mechanic. Each kill raises your adrenaline bar. 3 kills grants you 1 level of adrenaline, and there's 5 levels in total. Each level rewards you with a buff. This could be more melee damage, X-ray vision, or a larger window for your overload. However, getting hit a single time completely resets your adrenaline. This mechanic feeds best into the use of fodder type enemies, as you can quickly eliminate them and raise your adrenaline quite high. But this isn't something you have to be a master at, as it isn't overpowered at all, it just assists you in minor but helpful ways. The same philosophy is in the overload mechanic. When you use up your entire magazine, a little bar will begin to fill up, and if you hit R2 at the right time, you'll instantly reload. But if you miss it, you'll have to wait a couple more seconds. Again, this doesn't ruin the game if you're bad at it, because yeah, it can be really tough sometimes. You'll probably spend the majority of the time looking outside your aiming reticle because it's much more important to dodge incoming attacks rather than instantly reloading. But if you can master doing two things at once, you'll be rewarded with a higher DPS output. It's these two mechanics that will separate the good players and the great ones, but they don't break the game in any particular way because they're just assistant buffs. But they still reward skilled players, and I really appreciate that. I think this section has gone on for long enough, and I hope I have demonstrated correctly why this is my favourite third-person shooter of all time. After all the amazing things I've just talked about, you could probably imagine how much it pains me to say that Returnal's replayability is considerably weaker than its moment-to-moment gameplay, which is absolutely the best shit I've played this generation. For anyone thinking that this isn't a big compliment since the PS5 has only been out for 6 months, just remember, we've already had Miles Morales and Demon's Souls. Returnal is a masterpiece when it comes to shooting mechanics and movement, but it's a far, far weaker roguelike. For starters, let me say I'm a pretty casual roguelike player. I've only finished Hades and Dead Cells, but I did put a lot of hours into both of those. Okay, so from someone who is a casual in the roguelike genre, I believe what makes a good and addicting roguelike is the use of procedural generation, build variety, long-term progression, and replayability. And spoiler alert, I think Returnal is either disappointing or bland in these 4 areas. Procedural generation is a cornerstone in the roguelike genre because they're games designed around you doing the same thing over and over again, so it's important that the environment around you and the item placement is unique each run. Returnal features 6 biomes, and each of them use procedural generation, obviously, but I feel like there aren't enough unique tile sets for each biome. I found that after my second or third run through of each biome, I was seeing the same rooms with the same item placements and the same puzzles. This really hurts replayability because after 15 hours or after you finish the campaign, it feels like you're running through the same spaces you ran through a couple hours ago. The sense of exploration begins to get lost on you, and you start moving through these environments with your memory instead of immediacy. Build variety. Perhaps I was spoiled with Dead Cells and Hades, as these two games seem to have endless build variety. Dead Cells had hundreds of weapons and different pieces of equipment, and Hades, while only having 6 weapons, has multiple different versions of each of those weapons, on top of the god powers and boons you can unlock. Objectively, Returnal has a lot of variety, with 10 different weapons, all with unique traits, parasites that give you a buff and debuff at the same time, leading to a risk and reward system, 15 slots for different artifacts, which give you permanent buffs, health upgrades which can be found around the map, and consumables like health vials. There is a lot to pick up here, and each run should create build variety, but I don't think it has been balanced well enough. Parasites come in 2 flavors, ones with buffs that clearly outweigh the debuff associated with it, and ones that do not. These are never a hard decision to make, just don't pick up anything that hurts your mobility, and you'll be fine. Always sacrifice your melee damage, as a melee build will always be useless into late runs, because enemy projectiles will be guaranteed to hit you, and many of the bosses can't be damaged with melee attacks. Weapons drop at different levels based on your proficiency rating, but that can often be a dead choice if a gun you don't enjoy using drops, even if its level is higher, because you'll always do better using a weapon you're more comfortable with, rather than one that is objectively stronger. The inclusion of health upgrades is a necessity, but it adds nothing to build variety since there's no trade-off. It's a straight buff and one you'll always prioritize over anything else. I can't say there are a small number of things to pick up and tailor your build around, but I never found much variety in the systems Housemarque has built here. Next is long-term progression, and this is a simple thing to explain. Each run you want to permanently become a little stronger. Hades does this with the weapon traits like I explained earlier, or with the Mirror of Night, which allows you to level up things like your max health, the amount of currency you start with, and the number of dashes you can perform. There are a lot of little permanent upgrades, and it adds to a sense of progression even when you failed. Returnal does a very good job with this in the beginning with the Metroidvania-inspired pickups. You'll quickly get a sword, which lets you cut down vines and melee attack enemies. You'll get a hookshot, which allows you to get to new areas and move around environments easier. There's quite a few of them, but once you've unlocked all of these, your overall progression is basically halted completely. You do permanently keep the weapon traits you unlock, but these are so minor and don't give off the long-term progression you'll be looking for. And lastly is replayability, which obviously feeds into everything we've already spoken about. But there is one more thing that I haven't mentioned, and that's the length of these runs. See, a good roguelike should be easy to pick up and play, meaning you can quickly do a full run through in 30 to 40 minutes. That seems to be what the average roguelike goes for these days, and it's a good amount of time. But an average run on Returnal is upwards of an hour and a half, meaning each run can take a long ass time, and you need to mentally prepare before you start. On top of runs being insanely long, you also can't save your progression halfway through. Something that never really bothered me, but I'm completely aware that an hour and a half is a really long time to play, and having the fear of not being able to continue at a later time makes it so much worse. Your best alternative at the moment is putting your PS5 into rest mode, but if your power goes out or someone turns the PlayStation off, all your progression is wiped. If the game crashes, your progress is gone. I didn't have any crashes during my time with the game, but something needs to be done here. So due to the lack of meaningful build variety, not enough procedural generation, dull long-term progression once you hit the late game, and the length of time it takes you to complete a run really hurts the replayability and basically spoils the feeling of just one more run that most roguelikes are built on. How hard is Returnal is a question a lot of people have been asking, and my answer is going to be a bit of a cop-out because it is, and it also isn't. See, a good difficulty curve should look something like this, but Returnal's difficulty curve looks like this. The first biome is consistently the hardest, whether you're in Act 1 doing biomes 1 through 3, or Act 2 doing biomes 4 through 6. The first biome you need to clear will always be the hardest of the three, and this is due to you having no health upgrades, no buffs, and a basic pistol. It is important to note, however, that biomes 1 through 3, or better known as Act 1, is far easier than biomes 4 to 6, or Act 2, but the same difficulty curve persists. Bosses should be the peak of the difficulty, but they're actually pretty easy. I killed the first boss on my second attempt, and then killed the remaining 4 bosses on my first try every time. Now, I'm completely okay with this, because the bosses hit on every other level, but it does become strange when particular mini-boss enemies you can randomly find out in the world are far more challenging than the bosses. These mini-bosses that I spoke about earlier can come out of nowhere, and you have no idea when you'll run into one, meaning a good run can be completely ruined by being unprepared when walking into a room. These guys are also way tougher since they typically use melee attacks, which I swear have shit hitboxes. Couple all that with the bloated health bar and fodder enemies throwing projectiles at you makes these mini-bosses the biggest difficulty spikes in the game. So, is Returnal a hard game? 90% of the time it's not, but that 10% of the time that it is can and will give many players a lot of trouble. I finished Returnal after 14 hours, and even I got stuck in a couple places because of the difficulty spikes. And that's where I think I want to finish. I don't have a big bloated conclusion summing up all my thoughts about Returnal. I think this is a game of 2 parts. It's a masterpiece in third-person shooting, visual, and audio presentation, and a fine roguelike that does enough to keep you entertained until you see the credits roll, but probably won't keep players interested in the long run. Returnal is the best game to be released on the PS5 so far, and is unquestionably one of the greatest games I've ever played.